The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical lullaby above the courtroom, casting everything in a sterile glow that made skin look corpse pale and truth look negotiable. Catherine Morrison, Kate to everyone who'd ever mattered, sat alone at the metal table bolted to the floor, her uniform pressed to regulation perfection, ribbons aligned with the precision that came from 15 years of muscle memory. Her hands rested flat on the cold surface, palms down, fingers spread just enough to feel anchored. Around her, 20 senior officers arranged themselves in a semicircle of judgment, their uniforms heavy with rank and decades of decisions made from the safety of oak-paneled rooms. Lieutenant General Richard Thornton presided from the highest bench, silver hair combed with the care of a man who understood that appearance was half of authority. His chest bore ribbons that caught the overhead lights like tiny mirrors, reflecting back a career built on calculated moves and strategic vendettas. He leaned back in his chair with the ease of someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to be questioned, fingers interlaced, eyes scanning the room not to understand it but to dominate it. Kate had been sitting here for 40 minutes, answering questions that weren't really questions. Name, rank, service history, deployment dates. Each one delivered in tones designed to remind her of her place. She answered with the same level precision she'd used her entire career. No elaboration, no justification. Just facts, stripped of everything that made them human. The air in the room tasted recycled, filtered through machines that removed everything except oxygen and the faint chemical tang of industrial cleaning solutions. In the back row, almost invisible among the sea of uniforms, Rear Admiral Patricia Chen sat perfectly still, her hands resting on a thin folder in her lap. She hadn't spoken once since the proceedings began, but her presence registered in Kate's peripheral awareness like a lighthouse beam cutting through fog. Distant, but undeniable. Thornton flipped through Kate's file. Each page turned deliberate and amplified in the quiet. He paused on one section, jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, then closed the folder with a soft thud that landed like a gavel. The sound echoed. His voice when it came was conversational, almost amused. The kind of tone a man uses when he's already decided the outcome and is simply performing the ritual. Sergeant Morrison, you've had what some might call an unusual situation. Married into the Morrison family. Quite a step up for someone from your background. And now here you are, a widow with 2 children, living on a sergeant's salary while questions swirl around money that appeared in your account. Care to help us understand? Kate didn't hesitate, didn't shift in her seat, didn't give him the satisfaction of a visible reaction. I'm here to answer questions, sir. The air changed, just slightly. A collective lean forward, the scratch of pen on legal pad, someone clearing their throat in the third row. Thornton stood slowly, the movement calculated for effect, and descended from the bench. His boots echoed softly against the tile as he began to pace. A predator's patrol pattern, staying just close enough to remind Kate of the physical space he occupied in relation to her stillness. You were married to Lieutenant Daniel Morrison. Died 3 years ago in what the records call a training accident. My condolences, of course. The word condolences came wrapped in something that wasn't quite sympathy. But since then, Sergeant, financial irregularities have emerged. The Morrison Family Support Fund, established by your mother-in-law Victoria Morrison to help military families, has missing funds. And somehow, $380,000 found its way into an account bearing your name. He stopped pacing, turned to face her directly. How do you explain that? Kate met his gaze without flinching, without the defensive tension he was clearly hoping to provoke. I don't explain it, sir. I didn't take that money. A murmur rippled through the assembled officers, quickly stifled, but unmistakable. This wasn't the response they'd been primed for. This wasn't how these things usually went. Thornton's lips pressed into a thin line. He moved closer, close enough that Kate could smell aftershave and coffee and the faint musk of someone who'd been awake too long preparing for this moment. Bank records don't lie, Sergeant. The money went into your account. You're a widow with 2 teenagers and a sergeant's salary. Surely you needed it. Surely you noticed $380,000 appearing in your finances. Kate's breathing remained steady, measured. She stared straight ahead, not at him, not past him, through him. I noticed the account, sir. I didn't open it. Then who did? Someone who wanted it to look like I did. Behind Thornton, several officers exchanged glances. One shook his head. Another scribbled a note with unnecessary force. A colonel in the second row leaned toward his neighbor and whispered something that made the other man's eyebrows rise. Thornton placed both hands on the table, the sound sharp and final. "This panel needs to determine whether you belong in this uniform, Sergeant Morrison. And from where I'm standing, I see someone hiding behind denials while evidence piles up." That was when Kate understood with absolute clarity that this hearing had never been about facts. It had been designed to break her composure, to force either confession or collapse, to make an example that would satisfy whatever agenda had brought Thornton to this bench with her name on a file he'd clearly already judged. They expected her to flinch, to explain herself, to beg for understanding or mercy or another chance. They believed the weight of all that rank bearing down would eventually crack the silence, would ring out justification or tears or the performance of appropriate feminine distress. But 10 years ago, another woman had taught Kate something crucial about power. Victoria Morrison had been 52 when Daniel brought Kate home, already a self-made CEO with steel in her spine and calculation in every gesture. She'd looked at Kate, 19 years old, fresh from boot camp, wearing a dress borrowed from a friend because she didn't own anything nice enough for dinner with millionaires, and seen something that made her pause. The memory surfaced now, sharp and clear, cutting through the courtroom's antiseptic present. Kate had been terrified that night, sitting at a dining table worth more than her mother's annual salary, surrounded by crystal and silver and people who spoke in the casual shorthand of inherited wealth. Daniel's older brother Marcus had arrived late, his wife Jennifer on his arm, both of them dressed like they were attending a board meeting instead of a family dinner. Marcus was 32 then, a corporate lawyer with partnerships in 3 states, and the kind of confidence that came from never having wanted for anything. Jennifer moved through the room like she owned it by birthright rather than marriage. Victoria had been watching Kate's hands, the way they'd hesitated over the array of forks, the slight tremor when Kate reached for her water glass. Marcus had leaned back in his chair, wine glass dangling from his fingers with practiced casualness, and smiled at Kate with something that wasn't quite warmth. "So, Kate, Daniel tells us you're in the Marines, planning to make a career of it?" The question had sounded innocent, but the subtext rang clear. Was she planning to use Daniel as an escape route, or did she actually have ambitions beyond marrying into money? Kate's response had been quiet but firm. "Yes, sir. I'm training for reconnaissance. If I qualify, I'll request deployment." Jennifer's laugh had been light, musical, designed to wound while maintaining plausible deniability. "How adventurous. Daniel, you didn't mention your girlfriend was so independent." The word independent had carried the full weight of what Jennifer actually meant. Inappropriate, presumptuous, not our kind. But Victoria had set down her fork with precision, the tiny sound drawing every eye to her end of the table. Independence is the only trait that matters. Everything else can be taught or bought. But the ability to stand without needing someone else to hold you up? That's rare. She'd looked at Kaya then, really looked, the kind of gaze that stripped away pretense and performance, and saw down to the foundation. "Tell me, Kate, what would you do if Daniel asked you to choose between him and the Marines?" The question had silenced the table. Marcus had stopped mid-sip. Jennifer's smile had frozen in place. Daniel himself had tensed, clearly not expecting his mother to go for the throat quite so quickly. Kate had met Victoria's eyes without hesitation. "I tell him I love him, but I won't be anyone's choice if it means abandoning mine. If he can't accept both, then he doesn't really want me. He wants someone who'll reshape herself to fit his life." The silence that followed had felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, wind howling, nothing but empty air and consequence ahead. Then Victoria had smiled. Not the polite smile of social obligation, but something genuine and almost fierce. "Daniel, you chose well. This one won't be broken." But Marcus hadn't been convinced. After dinner, as Kate waited in the marble-floored foyer for Daniel to say goodnight to his family, Marcus had cornered her with Jennifer as backup. "Look, I'm going to be direct because someone needs to be. You seem like a nice girl, but you're out of your depth here. Daniel's going to inherit a significant portion of the Morrison estate. There are expectations. His wife will need to represent the family at certain functions, maintain certain standards. No offense, but can you picture yourself doing that?" Kate had felt the heat rising in her chest, the instinct to defend herself warring with the knowledge that anything she said would be used to prove Marcus's point about her unsuitability. But before she could respond, Victoria had appeared at the top of the stairs, her voice carrying down with the authority of someone who'd built an empire from $8 million and refused to apologize for any decision along the way. Marcus, if you're going to insult a guest in my house, at least have the courage to do it in front of me. Marcus had straightened, his lawyer's composure sliding back into place. Mother, I'm just being practical. Daniel's making a decision that affects the entire family. Daniel's making a decision that affects Daniel. The rest of you will adjust or you won't. I don't particularly care which. She descended the stairs with the measured pace of someone who'd learned that rushing signaled uncertainty, and stood beside Kate with a solidarity that had felt both surprising and strategic. Kate, walk with me to the study. In Victoria's study, a room lined with legal texts and business journals, dominated by a desk that looked like it had witnessed 1,000 negotiations. The older woman had poured 2 glasses of scotch despite Kate being underage, and handed one over with an expression that suggested she knew exactly what rules she was breaking and why. Marcus will fight this. Jennifer will poison every conversation with subtle suggestions that you're not suitable. They'll make Daniel's life difficult in ways that seem reasonable on the surface, but are designed to drive a wedge between you two. Kate had held the glass without drinking, uncertain whether this was a warning or a test. Why are you telling me this? Victoria had settled into the leather chair behind her desk. Every inch the CEO who turned a struggling defense contractor into a $150 million enterprise. Because if you're going to marry my son, you need to understand what you're walking into. This family has money and reputation and expectations that will be wielded against anyone who doesn't fit the predetermined mold. Daniel won't see it coming because he spent his whole life assuming everyone operates with his level of integrity. But you grew up poor. You understand that people will use whatever leverage they have to maintain their position. Are you trying to warn me off? I'm trying to prepare you. There's a difference. Victoria had taken a long sip of her scotch, her gaze never leaving Kate's face. Daniel told me he wants to marry you. If you say yes, I'll require a prenuptial agreement. Not because I don't trust you, but because Marcus will demand it, and I'd rather control the terms than let lawyers fight over them later. You'll sign something that says you have no claim to Daniel's inheritance or the family business if the marriage ends. The words had landed like a physical blow, confirming every fear Kate had harbored about being seen as a gold digger, about her poverty being held against her, about never being good enough for this world of crystal and silver and casual wealth. But Victoria hadn't finished. You'll sign it, and you'll do it without hesitation. Because the only way to prove you're not after money is to demonstrate you don't need it. Your dignity is worth more than any inheritance, Kate. Never forget that. Kate had understood then that this was Victoria's way of protecting her, of giving her armor against the accusations that would inevitably come. She'd set down the untouched scotch and met the older woman's gaze with the same directness Victoria seemed to respect. I'll sign whatever you want. I love Daniel, not his bank account. If he lost everything tomorrow, I'd still marry him. Victoria had smiled again, that same fierce expression that suggested she saw potential for an alliance, rather than just in-law obligation. Good. Then let's make sure you're protected when Marcus tries to take everything after I'm gone. The words had seemed paranoid at the time, the kind of cynical worldview that came from too many years in cutthroat business. But Kate had signed the prenuptial agreement without complaint, had stood beside Daniel at a small ceremony that Marcus and Jennifer conspicuously failed to attend, had built a life that existed parallel to the Morrison wealth without ever relying on it. For 10 years, it had worked. Daniel deployed, Kate deployed, they crossed paths between assignments and built something real in the spaces where their service overlapped. Jason was born, then Sophie, and Victoria transformed from skeptical matriarch to devoted grandmother, who showed up for every birthday, every school play, every milestone with gifts that were generous but never ostentatious. And during those years, in quiet moments stolen between Kate's deployments, Victoria taught her, not obviously, not in a way that Marcus or Jennifer would notice, but systematically, how to read a balance sheet, how to spot creative accounting, how to understand the difference between cash flow and actual value, how to recognize when someone was building an empire versus maintaining an inheritance. You have a good tactical mind, Kate. You assess threats, identify weaknesses, create contingency plans. Business isn't different, just slower and with different stakes. But the principles are the same. Know your objective, understand your adversary, never commit to a position you can't defend. Kate had absorbed it all while maintaining her own career, her own identity, her own purpose that existed independent of the Morrison name or fortune. She'd made sergeant, qualified for reconnaissance, earned respect that had nothing to do with who she'd married. Then 3 years ago, everything had shattered. The knock on Kate's door had come at 0400, the specific time when bad news couldn't wait for dawn. Two officers in dress uniforms, their faces already arranged in expressions of practiced sympathy. The words had been formal, efficient, designed to communicate tragedy without emotional contamination. Lieutenant Daniel Morrison, killed in action. Training accident, condolences, arrangements, benefits. Kate had been stationed at Camp Pendleton, 2,000 miles from where Daniel had been training with a new unit. She'd last spoken to him 3 days prior, a video call where he'd been exhausted but optimistic, talking about the mission parameters, about coming home in 6 weeks, about Jason's upcoming 16th birthday, and Sophie's science fair project. The military had been efficient about death. Paperwork materialized. Transportation was arranged. Kate found herself on a flight to Virginia with a folded flag in a plastic case, and a grief so enormous it felt like drowning in air. Jason and Sophie had been staying with Victoria while both their parents deployed. Kate arrived to find her children, 13 and 11 then, already folded into Victoria's care, their faces hollow with loss that no grandmother's comfort could fill. Jason had been angry, the kind of rage that came from feeling helpless. Sophie had been too quiet, shock manifesting as a terrible stillness that made Kate want to shake her just to confirm she was still present. The funeral had been military precision overlaid with Morrison family performance, a church filled with people who'd known Daniel as the younger Morrison son, the one who'd chosen service over corporate law, the one who'd married beneath his station but seemed happy anyway. Kate had sat in the front pew between her children, holding their hands while officers she didn't know delivered eulogies about honor and sacrifice in service. Marcus and Jennifer had been there, of course, dressed in expensive black, their grief performed with the same careful control they brought to board meetings. Marcus had hugged Kate with the requisite pressure, his voice low and sympathetic. "I know we haven't always seen eye to eye, Kate, but Daniel was my brother. If you need anything at all, you just have to ask." The words had sounded genuine enough that Kate almost believed them. Almost. But after the burial, after the 21-gun salute and the presentation of colors, after the endless line of people offering condolences that all sounded identical, Marcus had found Kate in a quiet corner of the reception held at Victoria's estate. Jennifer hadn't been with him this time. He'd come alone, his expression serious but not unkind, a folder tucked under his arm. "Kate, I hate to bring this up now, but there are some financial matters we need to address." Daniel had outstanding debts to the family business, loans he took out over the years for various investments that didn't pan out. Nothing huge, but the total comes to about $200,000. Kate had felt the floor tilt slightly, grief and exhaustion and sudden confusion creating a cocktail that made processing information difficult. Daniel never mentioned owing money to the business. Marcus had nodded sympathetically, his lawyer face firmly in place. "He probably didn't want to worry you. You had enough on your plate with your own career. But now that he's gone, the debt transfers to his estate, which means it's your responsibility. I've brought the paperwork." "Marcus." Victoria's voice had cut through the conversation like a blade. She'd materialized beside them with the uncanny timing of someone who'd been watching for exactly this moment. "My son isn't even cold in the ground and you're presenting debts? This is neither the time nor the place." Marcus had had the grace to look slightly abashed, but he hadn't retreated. "Mother, I'm just trying to handle things properly. Kate needs to know about the financial situation. Kate needs to grieve, the business can wait." But Marcus had already planted the seed. Over the following weeks, as Kate tried to navigate the impossible geometry of mourning while parenting while maintaining her military obligations, Jennifer began making comments. Small things, easily deniable, but consistently positioned to undermine. At Jason's 16th birthday celebration, held at Victoria's house because Kate's base housing felt too empty. "It must be hard managing on a sergeant's salary now that Daniel's gone. If you ever need help, you just have to ask." At Sophie's school conference where they discussed her declining grades, "Of course she's struggling. Poor thing, losing her father and now seeing her mother always deployed or working. Maybe a more stable home situation would help. Always phrased as concern, always delivered with plausible deniability, always designed to chip away at Kate's position, her competence, her right to raise her own children without Morrison family intervention. Then Victoria had her stroke. It happened 6 months after Daniel's funeral. Victoria had been at the Morrison Defense Contractor's office in the middle of a board meeting when she'd suddenly stopped mid-sentence. Her right hand had gone slack, her face drooping on one side, words slurring into incomprehensibility. By the time the ambulance arrived, she'd lost consciousness entirely. The doctors had been cautiously optimistic. She'd survived, the damage appeared manageable, there was potential for recovery. But she remained in a medically induced coma while swelling in her brain subsided, and visiting hours were strictly controlled. Kate had been at the hospital in Victoria's private room when Marcus arrived with paperwork that gave him medical power of attorney. He'd been efficient, professional, regretful. Mother had these documents drawn up years ago. Given her condition, I'll be making decisions about her care going forward. Kate had felt the ground shifting beneath her again, the sense that something larger was moving just outside her comprehension. What does that mean for? It means the family business needs leadership. I'll be stepping in as interim CEO until Mother recovers, and certain financial decisions that were pending will now move forward. He turned to the nurse then, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. Visiting privileges for Mrs. Morrison will be limited to immediate family only. That means myself and my wife. Mrs. Kate Morrison is extended family and should coordinate through me if she wishes updates. The nurse had glanced at Kate apologetically but hadn't argued. Hospital protocol apparently recognized legal authority over emotional connection. Kate had been escorted from the room before Victoria's monitors even stopped their steady beeping. Over the next year, Marcus consolidated control with methodical precision. He moved Victoria to a private care facility 2 hours from where Kate was stationed, making visits logistically difficult. He restructured Morrison Defense Contractors Management, placing Jennifer in a senior oversight role despite her having no experience in defense contracting. He began making comments at family gatherings, increasingly rare and increasingly tense, about financial irregularities that needed investigation. Jason, angry at the world and at his mother for not being present enough, began spending more time at Marcus's house. The older man had time, attention, expensive gifts, and a sympathetic ear for a teenager's rage at circumstances beyond his control. Your mom's doing her best, Jason, but she's overwhelmed. Maybe if she'd been more focused on family instead of her career, your dad would have gotten the support he needed. The words, reported back to Kate by Sophie who'd overheard them during a family dinner, had been designed to sound supportive while being anything but. Sophie remained loyal, but even she seemed confused by the growing division. The way her Uncle Marcus kept suggesting that maybe Kate couldn't handle raising 2 teenagers alone, that maybe a more stable environment would serve everyone's interests. Then had come the accusation. Marcus filed formal charges, claiming Kate had embezzled $380,000 from the Morrison Family Support Fund, a charity Victoria had established to help military families facing hardship. The fund had been Victoria's passion project, something she'd managed personally, distributing money to families who couldn't afford medical bills or rent while spouses deployed or dealing with PTSD treatment costs. Kate had been listed as a beneficiary manager, a largely ceremonial role that involved reviewing applications and making recommendations. She'd never had direct access to accounts, never moved money, never made unilateral decisions. But the evidence Marcus presented showed transactions that appeared damning. Deposits made into an account bearing Kate's name, withdrawals timed to coincide with her own financial struggles, patterns that suggested systematic theft over 3 years. Kate's initial attempts to fight the charges had been met with procedural obstacles. Marcus had connections throughout the military legal system, relationships built over decades of defense contracting work. He'd leveraged those connections to have the case transferred to military jurisdiction, arguing that Kate's position as both active-duty Marine and fund manager made this a matter of military justice. And Marcus had known exactly who to approach. General Richard Thornton had history with Victoria Morrison. Specifically, Victoria had once exposed a bidding scandal that Thornton had been involved in 20 years earlier. The revelation hadn't resulted in court-martial, but it had cost him a promotion and left him permanently stationed at positions just below where his career should have taken him. Thornton had accepted the case with enthusiasm that should have raised red flags, but instead registered as dedication to military justice. Now Kate sat in this courtroom, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, Thornton pacing in front of her like a shark who'd scented blood, while Marcus and Jennifer watched from the gallery with expressions of sympathetic concern that fooled absolutely no one who knew what to look for. Jason sat beside Marcus. That hurt more than anything, seeing her son aligned with the man trying to destroy her, his teenage face hard with the certainty that came from believing he understood the world better than the adults who'd failed to prevent his father's death. Sophie waited outside, too young to be present for proceedings that might determine whether she and Jason ended up in Marcus's custody. Admiral Chen sat in the back row, still silent, still watchful, her presence the only indication that perhaps this hearing wasn't entirely the foregone conclusion it appeared to be. Thornton had resumed his pacing, clearly building toward something, his voice taking on the cadence of a man preparing to deliver the killing blow. "Sergeant Morrison, let me lay this out clearly. You're a widow with 2 children. You live on a sergeant's salary, which we both know isn't generous. Your husband died leaving you with financial obligations, debts to the family business that Marcus Morrison has documented extensively. Your mother-in-law, who might have supported you, is incapacitated and unable to verify or deny any of these claims." He stopped pacing, turned to face her directly. $380,000 appeared in your account over 3 years. You claim you didn't take it, but you can't explain how it got there. You ask us to believe that someone set you up, but you offer no proof, no alternative theory, nothing except denial. He moved closer, his shadow falling across her. "Here's what I see. A woman who married into wealth, who lost her meal ticket when her husband died, who panicked and helped herself to money that was meant for other struggling military families. I see someone who thought she could hide behind her uniform and her widow status, and no one would dare question her." The air in the room felt charged, every officer leaning forward, waiting for Kate to break, to defend herself with the desperation that would confirm everything Thornton was suggesting. But Kate remained still, her hands flat on the cold metal, her breathing steady, her gaze fixed on a point just beyond Thornton's shoulder. The silence stretched. Thornton's patience finally cracked. "Damn it, Sergeant, defend yourself! Explain how we're wrong! Give me something to work with here!" Kate shifted her gaze to meet his. Her voice when it came was calm, almost gentle, but with an edge underneath that suggested bedrock rather than surface. "General Thornton, with respect, I don't need to defend myself against lies." The murmur that swept the room was louder this time, less easily contained. Several officers looked at each other with expressions that ranged from shock to intrigue. In the gallery, Marcus straightened slightly, his confident posture developing a hairline crack. Thornton's face flushed. "Lies? You're calling documented evidence lies?" "I'm saying that documentation can be falsified. And I'm suggesting that maybe you should ask yourself why Marcus Morrison brought this case to you specifically, General. What history do you have with Victoria Morrison that might make you particularly eager to prosecute someone with her name?" The room went dead silent. Chen leaned forward slightly in her seat, the first movement she'd made since the proceedings began. Thornton's flush deepened, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "Careful, Sergeant. You're already in enough trouble without adding insubordination." "I'm not being insubordinate, sir. I'm pointing out that this entire proceeding might be built on a foundation you haven't fully examined. You've accepted Marcus Morrison's evidence at face value. Have you questioned why a man would accuse his dead brother's widow of embezzling from a fund his mother established? What does he gain if I'm found guilty?" Marcus stood abruptly in the gallery, his lawyer instincts finally overriding his strategy of silent observation. "This is absurd. General, I brought evidence to you in good faith. I don't appreciate being accused of—" "Sit down, Mr. Morrison." The command came from Admiral Chen, who had finally risen from her seat in the back row. Her voice carried the kind of authority that came from decades at the highest levels of Navy command, the tone that made full-bird colonels check their posture. Marcus sat. Chen walked forward with measured steps, her eyes on Thornton rather than Kate. "General Thornton, I've sat here listening to this proceeding for over an hour. I've heard accusations. I've heard presumptions. What I haven't heard is actual investigation. When was the last time military tribunal convicted someone based entirely on financial documents provided by a family member who stands to benefit from that conviction?" Thornton bristled. "Admiral, with respect, this isn't your case." "No, but it's happening in a military court under my oversight jurisdiction. And I'm suggesting we pause these proceedings until a more thorough investigation has been conducted. Specifically, an investigation into Marcus Morrison's financial activities and his relationship to the alleged missing funds. Marcus stood again, Jennifer rising beside him, both of their faces carefully controlled but radiating fury underneath. "This is outrageous. I'm the one who brought the evidence forward. You can't investigate me." Chen turned to look at him for the first time, her expression neutral but her eyes cold. "Mr. Morrison, if your evidence is legitimate, an investigation will confirm that. Unless you have reason to fear scrutiny?" The trap was elegant, and Marcus had walked directly into it. Refusing investigation suggested guilt. Accepting it meant delay and potential exposure of whatever he'd been hiding. Jennifer grabbed his arm, her whisper audible in the tense silence. "Marcus, we should get our lawyer." "We don't need a lawyer, we didn't do anything wrong." But the words lacked conviction, and everyone in the room heard it. Thornton looked between Chen and Marcus, clearly calculating, perhaps realizing for the first time that he'd been used, that his eagerness for vengeance against anything Morrison-related had made him into someone's tool. Kate remained seated, watching it all unfold with the same careful stillness she'd maintained throughout. Inside her jacket pocket, her fingers touched the edge of an envelope she'd carried into this courtroom, knowing she might never need to use it. But if she did, if the moment came when silence was no longer protection but surrender, she had everything ready. 3 years of waiting, 3 years of letting Marcus consolidate power, of letting him believe she was helpless, of letting him dig his own grave while she documented every shovelful of dirt. Victoria's voice echoed in her memory, words spoken in the study all those years ago. "Never stop your enemy when they're making a mistake. Let them commit. Let them overreach. Then strike when they're too extended to defend themselves." Kate had committed those words to heart and to strategy. Thornton finally spoke, his voice lacking its earlier certainty. "Sergeant Morrison, Admiral Chen has raised valid procedural concerns. I'm ordering a recess while—" "No." Kate's voice cut through the room, quiet but absolute. Everyone turned to look at her. She stood slowly, her movements precise, and reached into her jacket. The entire room tensed. Several officers' hands moved instinctively towards sidearms they weren't carrying, until Kate withdrew the envelope and placed it on the table. "General Thornton, Admiral Chen, I appreciate the procedural consideration, but I don't need more time or investigation. I need 5 minutes to present 3 documents. After that, this case will be closed." Thornton stared at the envelope like it might contain a live grenade. "What documents?" Kate met his eyes with the same steady gaze she'd maintained throughout. But now there was something else underneath. Not triumph, not anger, just the calm certainty of someone who'd been preparing for this exact moment for 3 years and was finally ready to execute. The first document is a letter from Victoria Morrison, written 1 week before her stroke, explaining the truth about the Morrison family trust and her intentions for distribution. It's notarized, witnessed, and very specific about what she expected Marcus to do after she was incapacitated. In the gallery, Marcus had gone pale, his hand gripping the bench in front of him. The second document is a complete banking analysis, showing that the $380,000 Marcus claims I embezzled actually came from his offshore account in the Cayman Islands, was briefly deposited in an account opened fraudulently in my name, then returned to Marcus's account within 48 hours. Jennifer grabbed Marcus's arm again, her whisper frantic now. "The third document is proof that I was never the struggling widow everyone assumed. I have assets, investments, and financial security that I deliberately didn't disclose because I wanted to see exactly what Marcus would do if he believed I was vulnerable." She looked directly at Marcus then, speaking to him rather than the court. "You thought I needed your money, Marcus. You thought I was desperate and helpless. You thought you could frame me for your own embezzlement and take custody of Jason and Sophie, and through them, control the $45 million Victoria left in trust for them." Jason stood abruptly, his teenage face stricken, finally understanding that the uncle who'd been so sympathetic, so supportive, had been using him as a pawn in a theft scheme. Kate's voice remained steady, but underneath it ran something fierce and unforgiving. "But I didn't need your money. I didn't need your help. What I needed was for you to expose yourself so thoroughly, so publicly, that no one, not even General Thornton with all his vendetta against the Morrison name, could ignore what you really are." She turned back to Thornton and Chen. So, no, I don't need more time. I need you to look at these documents. And then I need you to arrest Marcus Morrison for fraud, embezzlement, perjury, and whatever other charges apply to a man who tried to steal his own mother's fortune by destroying his dead brother's widow. The words hung in the air like smoke after a firefight. Visible, toxic, impossible to ignore. And in that moment, Kate Morrison ceased being a defendant and became exactly what Victoria had always seen in her. A woman who couldn't be broken, wouldn't be intimidated, and who understood that real power came not from volume or violence, but from knowing exactly when to speak and what to say when silence finally ended. Thornton's hand hovered over the envelope for 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. Around the courtroom, the air had transformed from judicial proceeding to something closer to detonation, everyone waiting for the blast radius to reveal itself. Admiral Chen moved first, stepping forward with the authority of someone who'd spent 30 years navigating political minefields and knew exactly when to claim territory. General Thornton, I'm invoking oversight authority. Clear this room of all non-essential personnel immediately. Thornton's jaw worked silently. His vendetta against Victoria Morrison had brought him here, had made him eager to prosecute anyone carrying that surname. But Chen's rank and jurisdiction left him no room to maneuver. All junior officers are dismissed. Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, you'll wait in the corridor. Marcus was already shaking his head, his lawyer instincts overriding whatever panic was building behind his carefully maintained expression. I have a right to be present. This is my evidence you're reviewing. Chen turned the full weight of her attention on him, her voice dropping to a register that made seasoned admirals reconsider their arguments. Mr. Morrison, you're a civilian observer who brought accusations to a military court. You have no rights in this proceeding beyond what we grant you. And right now, I'm granting you the right to leave before I have MPs escort you out in restraints. Jennifer grabbed Marcus's arm with enough force that her knuckles went white, her whisper cutting through the tension. Marcus, for God's sake, just do what she says. But Marcus remained frozen, staring at the envelope on the table like it contained photographic evidence of every mistake he'd ever made. Which, Kate reflected with cold satisfaction, it essentially did. 2 military police officers appeared at the doorway. Chen must have called them earlier, must have sensed where this was heading, and their presence made the choice for Marcus. He turned and walked toward the exit with Jennifer half a step behind, both of them moving like people approaching execution rather than temporary exclusion. Jason stood in the gallery, his teenage face cycling through confusion and dawning horror, looking between his mother at the defense table and his uncle heading for the door. Kate met her son's eyes and held them, not with pleading or accusation, just steady acknowledgement that he was old enough to witness what came next. Jason stays. Chen glanced at Kate, then at the 16-year-old boy whose world was clearly fracturing in real time. That's highly irregular, Sergeant Morrison. He's been part of Marcus's case against me. He deserves to hear the truth. Jason remained standing, uncertain whether he was being invited or commanded, until Kate gestured to the front row bench. He moved forward slowly, his earlier certainty replaced with something that looked like the first stages of grief. The room emptied of everyone except Thornton, Chen, Kate, Jason, and 5 senior officers, whose clearances apparently warranted their continued presence. The cameras had already been deactivated. Chen had handled that with a subtle hand signal to the technician before Marcus even understood what was happening. Thornton finally picked up the envelope, broke the seal with more force than necessary, and withdrew 3 separate document bundles, each marked with colored tabs: blue, red, green. Kate had organized them with the precision she brought to everything, each piece of evidence indexed and cross-referenced, because sloppiness was how cases fell apart. The first bundle contained 7 pages, the letterhead immediately recognizable as Morrison Defense Contractors Legal Stationery. Victoria's signature dominated the bottom of each page, bold and uncompromising, notarized by 3 separate witnesses whose credentials were listed in meticulous detail. Chen moved to stand beside Thornton, reading over his shoulder, her expression shifting from judicial neutrality to something approaching shock as she processed the first paragraph. This is dated April 15th, 2022, 1 week before Victoria Morrison's stroke. Kate's voice remained level, professional, stripped of the emotion churning underneath. Victoria knew Marcus would move against me the moment she couldn't protect me directly. She prepared accordingly. Thornton began reading aloud, his voice losing its prosecutorial edge as Victoria's words flowed from the page like testimony from beyond incapacitation. To whom it may concern, I, Victoria Morrison, age 59, founder and CEO of Morrison Defense Contractors, being of sound mind and clear judgment, write this letter to clarify my intentions regarding my estate and to expose a truth I have hidden for the sake of family unity, but can no longer ignore. The words landed in the room with the weight of confessional rather than legal document. Jason leaned forward, his hands gripping the bench in front of him. Thornton continued, but his voice had dropped, as if reading someone's suicide note rather than their strategic defense against predictable betrayal. When my son Daniel married Catherine Parker, I opposed the marriage initially, not because Kate lacked worth or character, but because I understood that my eldest son Marcus would never accept her. Marcus has spent his entire adult life believing that birth order should determine inheritance, that being my firstborn granted him automatic claim to everything I built. He has never forgiven me for building Morrison Defense, from $8 million to $150 million through my own labor, believing instead that as the eldest son, he deserved to inherit the company his father left behind. But I built this empire. It is mine to distribute as I see fit. One of the senior officers, a colonel whose name Kate had never learned, leaned back in his chair with an audible exhale. Chen's expression remained neutral, but something in her posture suggested she was recalculating everything she'd assumed about this case. Over the past 10 years, I have watched Kate prove herself repeatedly. Not through marriage to my son, not through claims of devotion, but through her actions, when no one was watching to reward them. She signed a prenuptial agreement without complaint or negotiation. She raised my grandchildren with dignity while maintaining her own military career. She refused every advantage her marriage could have provided. When other military spouses sought financial help or special treatment, Kate never asked for anything beyond what she'd earned through her own service. Jason's breathing had become audible, quick and shallow, the kind of hyperventilation that comes from understanding that your entire worldview has been constructed on sand. 3 years ago, when Daniel died, I observed Marcus's immediate response. Within hours of the funeral, he approached Kate about fabricated debts. He began positioning himself to control Daniel's portion of inheritance. He whispered poison about Kate to anyone who would listen, suggesting she was unstable, financially irresponsible, incapable of raising Jason and Sophie alone. I remained silent, not because I condoned his behavior, but because I needed to see exactly how far he would go. I needed proof of his character before I made final decisions about succession. Thornton looked up from the document, his face drained of color, finally understanding that he'd been weaponized in a family power struggle that had nothing to do with military justice and everything to do with greed dressed as concern. Therefore, I have established the Morrison Family Trust with the following provisions that supersede all previous wills, agreements, and verbal promises. Kate felt her pulse accelerate slightly, the first crack in her careful composure, because this was the moment Victoria's protection became tangible, became enforceable, became the weapon that would destroy Marcus's entire strategy. First, $45 million will be held in irrevocable trust for Catherine Morrison and her children Jason and Sophie Morrison. The trust will be administered by Catherine with full discretionary control upon her demonstration that she can withstand Marcus's inevitable attacks without surrendering dignity or agency. The trustee bank has been instructed to release funds only when Catherine presents evidence that Marcus has publicly exposed himself through actions that reveal his true nature. Jason made a sound somewhere between laugh and sob, his teenage brain finally processing that his uncle's sympathy, his generous offers, his constant implications that Kate was failing as a mother, all of it had been calculated manipulation designed to separate him from his mother, so Marcus could control the money Victoria had intended for her grandchildren. Second, Marcus Morrison and Jennifer Morrison will each receive $5 million. This is generous compensation that reflects their relationship to me, while acknowledging that neither has contributed to Morrison Defense Contractors' growth in any meaningful capacity. Marcus's legal work for the company has been adequately compensated through standard fees. Jennifer has contributed nothing beyond social performance at corporate functions. Chen let out a breath that might have been a laugh under different circumstances. The colonel who'd exhaled earlier was now openly grinning, clearly enjoying watching a corporate power play dismantle itself through its subjects' own arrogance. Third, the remaining $55 million of my personal estate will be distributed to the Morrison Defense Contractors Employee Retirement Fund, ensuring that the men and women who actually built this company's success are protected in their later years. This bequest specifically excludes any executive officers hired after my incapacitation, as I do not trust Marcus to appoint leadership that serves employee interest over personal profit. Thornton set down the first page, picked up the second, his hands not quite steady. I am writing this letter because I know Marcus will attempt to destroy Kate after I'm gone. He will fabricate evidence, manipulate narratives, use every legal and social tool at his disposal to paint her as unworthy, unstable, or criminal. This is his nature. He cannot accept that someone he considers beneath him through accident of birth has been granted what he feels entitled to through no virtue beyond emerging from my body first. Victoria's words cut through the courtroom with surgical precision, each sentence revealing years of observation, of watching Marcus's resentment calcify into something dangerous. But I have also prepared Kate for this fight. For 10 years, I have taught her about business, about finance, about the mechanics of corporate warfare. Not obviously, not in ways Marcus would notice, but systematically. I showed her balance sheets and explained creative accounting. I taught her to recognize when someone is building genuine value versus maintaining inherited position. I introduced her to my network of advisors and ensured they understood she had my full confidence. I did this because I knew that if Kate survived Marcus's attacks, she would be capable of leadership that serves rather than exploits. Jason stood abruptly, his teenage body unable to contain the emotion flooding through him. He took 3 steps toward Kate, stopped, his voice breaking when words finally emerged. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I thought he told me you were, Kate raised one hand slightly, not quite reaching toward him, letting him choose whether to close the distance. This wasn't a moment for rushing, for overwhelming him with forgiveness he hadn't yet earned through understanding rather than just regret. Listen first, apologize after you've heard everything. He sank back onto this bench, but closer now, within touching distance if either of them reached. Thornton continued reading, his earlier antagonism replaced with something that looked uncomfortably like shame. Kate, if you are reading this publicly, it means you have done exactly what I hoped. You have stood your ground without surrendering principle. You have refused to be broken by pressure that would have destroyed lesser women. You have let Marcus expose himself so thoroughly that even those predisposed to believe the worst about you cannot ignore his betrayal. The words felt like Victoria speaking directly into the courtroom, her voice echoing from somewhere beyond the stroke that had stolen her capacity for intervention, but not for prophecy. Now, take what is yours. Not because you need it. We both know you are more resourceful than Marcus ever imagined, but because it represents Jason and Sophie's future, and they deserve inheritance earned through genuine love rather than biological accident. Protect my grandchildren from their uncle's toxicity. Show them that strength without mercy becomes cruelty, but mercy without strength becomes exploitation. Chen moved away from Thornton, walked to where Kate sat, and spoke in a voice meant only for her. She knew. All of it, she predicted every move. Kate met the Admiral's eyes with something that might have been grief, or might have been satisfaction, or might have been the exhausted recognition that even love can be tactical, when the people you're protecting face predators in family clothing. Victoria taught me that power is valueless if you can't deploy it when necessary. She spent 10 years making sure I wouldn't be helpless when Marcus came for me. The final paragraph of Victoria's letter carried the weight of benediction and command combined. To the military officers reading this, Catherine Morrison has served with distinction for 15 years. She has raised 2 children, largely alone, while maintaining operational readiness. She has never asked for special treatment or used her connection to my family for advancement. The charges brought against her are fabrications designed to discredit her so that Marcus can seize control of assets he believes should have been his. I implore you to investigate not Kate's actions, but Marcus's finances. particularly his offshore accounts, and his management of the Morrison Family Support Fund that he claims Kate embezzled from, you will find that the true criminal is the one who brought the accusations. The letter concluded with Victoria's signature, 3 witness signatures including Admiral Chen's own, and a notary seal certifying the document's legitimacy. Silence filled the courtroom like floodwater, everyone processing implications that extended far beyond military justice into civil fraud, perjury, conspiracy, and whatever other charges applied to a man who tried to frame his dead brother's widow for his own theft. Thornton set down the letter with extraordinary care, as if it might shatter, and looked at Kate with an expression that cycled through disbelief, anger at being used, and grudging respect for the level of strategic preparation Victoria had achieved. Sergeant Morrison, if this letter is authentic, it is, then this case should never have reached military court. This is a civil matter at best, criminal fraud at worst, and I've been... He stopped himself from completing the sentence. But everyone heard the unspoken words, manipulated, weaponized, made into someone's tool. Kate reached for the second bundle, the red tab documents that would transform Victoria's accusations into concrete evidence. General Thornton, the letter establishes Victoria's intentions and her predictions about Marcus's behavior. These establish that her predictions were accurate. She extracted a thick sheaf of banking records, each page marked with highlighted sections and explanatory notes in margins, the work of someone who'd spent months building an airtight case rather than a desperate defense assembled overnight. Chen took the documents, began paging through with increasing speed, her military bearing cracking slightly to reveal the shock underneath. These are Marcus Morrison's offshore accounts. Cayman Islands, Isle of Man, Belize. How did you... Victoria gave me access to all family financial records before her stroke. She'd been monitoring Marcus's activities for years. She knew he was siphoning money from Morrison defense contractors, hiding assets offshore, preparing for some kind of hostile takeover attempt. Kate pointed to a highlighted section on page 3, her fingers steady despite the adrenaline that must be flooding her system. That account, the one registered under my maiden name Catherine Parker, was opened March 2, 2023. The signature on the opening documents is forged. I have handwriting analysis from 3 independent experts confirming the signature isn't mine. Thornton leaned over Chen's shoulder, his face growing progressively more ashen as he traced the money trail Kate had documented with forensic precision. $380,000 deposited from Morrison Family Support Fund on March 15th. Withdrawn 48 hours later, transferred to an account in Marcus Morrison's name. Kate's voice remained clinical, stripped of triumph or anger, delivering facts that spoke more powerfully than any emotional appeal could have managed. Marcus moved Victoria's money into an account he opened in my name, waited 2 days to establish a paper trail, then moved it into his own offshore holdings. He kept the deposit records but deleted the withdrawal records from the family fund's official books. To anyone investigating, it looks like I took the money and it disappeared. But the complete banking records show exactly where it went and who controls it now. One of the senior officers, a Navy captain with enough ribbons to suggest he'd seen his share of fraudulent schemes, spoke for the first time since the room had been cleared. This is federal banking fraud, wire fraud. If he used electronic communications to coordinate this, that's another count. And perjury for bringing false charges. We're looking at 10 years minimum. Chen closed the documents, held them against her chest, like she was protecting evidence that might try to escape. General Thornton, I'm recommending immediate civilian law enforcement involvement. This is beyond military jurisdiction. But Thornton was staring at Kate with an expression that had moved past shock into something approaching horror. You knew. You've had this evidence since when? Since 7 months ago. Victoria's attorney, Samuel Garrett, compiled it and delivered it to me 3 months after her stroke. He'd been instructed to gather everything if Victoria became incapacitated, and Marcus began moving against me. Then why didn't you present it immediately? Why let this hearing proceed? Why sit here and let us accuse you of... Kate interrupted with a gentleness that somehow made the words cut deeper. Because Victoria taught me that defending yourself against lies gives them legitimacy. If I'd presented evidence immediately, Marcus would have claimed I fabricated it, that I'd stolen Victoria's files, that I was the one manipulating records. He would have tied this up in courts for years while poisoning Jason and Sophie against me. But if I let him build his case, let him present his fraudulent evidence to military court, let him commit perjury in front of 20 senior officers, She let the sentence trail off, the implication clear. Marcus had built his own gallows and climbed the steps voluntarily, confidently, never suspecting the trap had been set years before he'd even conceived of springing it. Chen actually smiled, a brief flash of appreciation for strategy that mirrored her own tactical training. You let him overcommit. Classic military doctrine. Never interrupt your enemy when they're making a mistake. Victoria's favorite lesson. She said patience was the most powerful weapon in any negotiation, because the person who needs a quick resolution always loses. Marcus needed me destroyed immediately so he could take control before anyone questioned his management of Victoria's estate. I just needed to survive long enough for him to reveal himself. The third bundle, green-tabbed and thinner than the others, remained on the table. Thornton looked at it like it might contain additional explosions, his appetite for revelation clearly exhausted. Is there more? Just one final piece. Not evidence of Marcus's crimes, but context that might help you understand why Victoria chose me over him. Kate opened the green bundle to reveal investment portfolios, banking statements, and life insurance documentation bearing her name. The numbers were large enough to make several officers lean forward involuntarily. When Daniel died, he left me a $2.5 million life insurance policy, standard military coverage with additional private policies he'd purchased. I received the payout 36 months ago. Thornton's eyes widened slightly, his mental image of Kate as struggling widow clearly requiring revision. Instead of spending it, I followed Victoria's investment advice. She'd spent 10 years teaching me about market analysis, portfolio diversification, risk management. My current holdings are valued at $4.2 million. The numbers hung in the air, reshaping everyone's assumptions about Kate's motivations, her vulnerability, her supposed desperation that had made embezzlement seem plausible. I didn't need Marcus's money. I didn't need Victoria's trust fund. I could have retired from the Marines tomorrow and lived comfortably for the rest of my life. But I stayed in uniform. I maintained base housing instead of buying a home. I drove a 15-year-old car and shopped at commissary sales. I lived like someone struggling because I wanted Marcus to believe I was desperate enough to steal. Jason made another sound, this one pure anguish, finally understanding that his mother's modest lifestyle hadn't been failure or inadequacy, but calculated misdirection designed to protect him from an uncle whose love had always been transactional. You let us think I thought you couldn't afford. I needed you to be genuine when Marcus questioned you. If you'd known I had money, known about Victoria's trust, known about any of this, you would have reacted differently when Marcus suggested I was embezzling. Your anger at me, your disappointment, your willingness to believe his version, that made his case seem credible. That made today possible. The words landed like physical blows. Jason's face crumpled, teenage pride warring with the realization that he'd been simultaneously protected and manipulated, kept ignorant for strategic purposes that served his ultimate welfare, while feeling like betrayal. Kate stood, closed the distance between them, and placed one hand on her son's shoulder. Not pulling him close, not forcing connection, just offering anchor. I'm sorry you had to learn this way. I'm sorry you spent 3 years believing your mother was failing. But I couldn't risk Marcus understanding what Victoria had planned until it was too late for him to adapt. The courtroom door burst open before Jason could respond, Marcus filling the doorway with Jennifer one step behind, both of their faces reflecting the panic that comes from standing outside a room where your entire life is being dismantled. General Thornton, we've waited long enough. Either charge my sister-in-law or release her. But this secretive proceeding is... Mr. Morrison. Chen's voice cut through Marcus's momentum like a blade through fog. She held up the red-tabbed bundle, her expression professionally neutral but her eyes hard as concrete. We need to discuss your offshore banking activities. Marcus froze mid-step, his lawyer reflexes apparently encountering a scenario he'd never prepared for. Being the subject of investigation, rather than the concerned family member bringing evidence forward. I don't know what you're talking about. Jennifer grabbed his arm again, her whisper urgent enough to carry across the courtroom. Marcus, don't say anything. We need to call Harrison, their attorney, presumably, right now. But Marcus was staring at the documents in Chen's hands, his face cycling through denial, calculation, and finally landing on fury directed entirely at Kate. You had these the whole time. You let me bring charges, let me testify, let me... His voice broke off as understanding bloomed. Kate had allowed him to commit perjury, to submit falsified evidence, to build a case on fabrications that could now be proven false with documentation he'd never suspected existed. "You set me up." Kate's response was delivered with the same level calm she'd maintained throughout, but underneath ran steel sharp enough to cut bone. "No, Marcus, I gave you an opportunity to be the man Victoria hoped you could be. You chose to use that opportunity to try destroying me so you could steal from your own nephews. You set yourself up. I just documented it." The distinction mattered, the difference between entrapment and allowing someone to reveal their nature through their own choices. Kate hadn't forced Marcus to forge documents, to open accounts in her name, to move money illegally. She'd simply created conditions where his greed would express itself so blatantly that no amount of legal maneuvering could obscure the truth. Marcus turned to Thornton, his lawyer persona reassembling itself, looking for allies or at least neutral arbitrators. "General, you can't seriously be considering. This is clearly fabricated evidence. She's had 3 years to create false documentation, to..." The documents are authenticated by 6 different financial institutions across 3 countries. Your signatures are on the account opening paperwork. The money trail is documented by banks that have no connection to Kate Morrison or Victoria Morrison. Thornton's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who just realized he'd been comprehensively used, that his eagerness for revenge against the Morrison name had made him into a weapon that nearly destroyed an innocent woman while letting the actual criminal hide behind concern. "Mr. Morrison, you're going to need that attorney your wife mentioned, and you're not leaving this building until federal agents arrive to discuss fraud charges." Jennifer released Marcus's arm like it had suddenly heated to burning temperature, taking 2 steps back, her face showing the calculation of someone deciding whether loyalty or self-preservation should guide her next moves. "I didn't know about the offshore accounts. Marcus handled all the finances. I'm not part of whatever..." "Mrs. Morrison?" Kate's voice stopped Jennifer's retreat. She produced one more sheet from the green bundle, this one showing email chains, text messages, communications between Marcus and Jennifer that detailed exactly how much both of them had known about the scheme to frame Kate. "You wrote to Marcus on March 20th. Once we frame her for embezzlement, we can have her declared an unfit mother. We'll get custody of the kids and through them control the trust. Would you like to continue claiming ignorance?" Jennifer went very still, her social performance finally dropping away to reveal the calculating predator underneath. Her voice when it came was stripped of warmth, naked self-interest speaking plainly for the first time. "How much do you want? To make this go away? To not pursue charges against me? How much?" The question revealed everything. The assumption that morality was negotiable, that problems could be solved with money, that everyone had a price if you could just identify the right number. It was the worldview of someone who'd never encountered a situation that wealth couldn't solve, or adversary who couldn't be bought. Kate's response carried the full weight of everything Victoria had taught her about power that couldn't be purchased. "I don't want your money, Jennifer. I want you to understand that some things can't be fixed with checkbooks. You tried to take my children, tried to destroy my reputation, tried to erase 3 years of my life so you could steal inheritance meant for Jason and Sophie. There's no amount of money that makes that acceptable." Jason had been watching this exchange with growing horror, his uncle's mask completely fallen away, his aunt revealed as co-conspirator rather than unwitting spouse. His voice, when he finally managed to speak, was raw with betrayal that cut deeper than anger. "You said Mom was unstable. You said she couldn't take care of us properly. You said we'd be better off with you." Marcus turned toward his nephew, and for a moment, something like genuine emotion flickered across his face. Regret, or perhaps just frustration that his careful manipulation had failed at the final moment. "Jason, you have to understand the money was supposed to be mine. Daniel was younger, he shouldn't have gotten equal share. And then he married someone completely inappropriate, and suddenly half the estate was going to her children instead of staying in the family. We are the family." Jason's shout echoed off the courtroom walls, 17 years of certainty shattering into understanding that his uncle had never seen him as family, only as obstacle to wealth that Marcus felt entitled to by birth order. "Daniel was my father. Sophie and I are Morrisons, but you never saw us that way, did you? We were just inconvenient claims on money you thought belonged to you." Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but whatever words he'd been preparing died unspoken as Jason stood and walked away from him, crossed the space to where Kate stood, and wrapped his arms around his mother with the desperate strength of someone who just realized how close he'd come to losing something irreplaceable. Kate held him, one hand on the back of his head, feeling him shake with sobs he was trying to contain, finally letting herself show emotion that wasn't strategic or controlled. This was her son, her child, who'd believed terrible things about her because she'd needed him to, and who was now breaking apart from the weight of understanding exactly what that deception had cost them both. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry. I should have believed you. I should have trusted." She tightened her arms, cutting off his apology with embrace rather than words, letting him feel forgiveness before she spoke it. "You were hurt and angry, and he knew exactly how to use that. You're 16. You're not supposed to see through manipulation from adults you trust. That's why we protect children, Jason. Not just from strangers, but from family who treat love like currency." Behind them, military police were entering the courtroom at Chen's signal, moving toward Marcus and Jennifer with practiced efficiency. Marcus was still staring at Kate, his expression cycling through rage and disbelief, unable to process how completely he'd been outmaneuvered by someone he'd dismissed as insignificant. "You're just like her, ruthless and calculating and willing to sacrifice anything?" "No." Kate's voice cut through Marcus's attempt to paint her as Victoria's mirror image. "I'm not like Victoria. I'm what Victoria hoped I could be, strong enough to protect what matters without becoming cruel in the process. You thought strength meant taking whatever you could get away with. Victoria taught me that strength means knowing when you could destroy someone and choosing not to." She glanced at the MPs positioning themselves on either side of Marcus. "I could have presented this evidence quietly, could have had you arrested without public revelation, but you needed to understand what you'd become, needed to face the consequences in front of the family you were willing to betray. That's not cruelty, Marcus. That's mercy. You get to learn from this. You get to become better if you choose to." The distinction seemed lost on Marcus, whose face had settled into bitter resentment, but Jennifer surprised everyone by laughing, sharp, ugly sounds stripped of her earlier social polish. "Become better? We're going to prison. How is that mercy?" Kate turned to face her, and her response carried the accumulated wisdom of 10 years learning from a woman who'd built an empire through understanding that vengeance and justice weren't synonyms. "Because I'm not pursuing maximum charges. Because I'm not going after your house, your assets, your everything. Because even though you tried to take my children, I'm not trying to destroy you completely. That's the difference between power and cruelty. Power means having the ability to obliterate someone and choosing restraint instead." The MPs were placing handcuffs on Marcus now, reading him rights in the practiced monotone of officers who'd performed this ritual countless times. Jennifer received the same treatment, her earlier calculation replaced with shock at the speed with which her life had transformed from comfortable privilege to federal charges. As they were escorted toward the door, Marcus looked back one final time, his voice carrying desperate confusion. "Why did she choose you? What made you so special that my own mother gave you everything?" Kate could have remained silent, could have let him leave with that question unanswered. But Victoria had taught her that sometimes the most powerful lesson was truth delivered without malice. "She didn't give me everything, Marcus. She gave me opportunity. The difference is I used it to build something instead of feeling entitled to what others created. That's why Victoria chose me, not because I was special, but because I was willing to earn what she offered." The door closed behind Marcus and Jennifer, leaving the courtroom feeling larger and somehow cleaner, as if their removal had improved the air quality. Thornton stood motionless, still holding Victoria's letter, looking at Kate with an expression that mixed shame with reluctant respect. "Sergeant Morrison, I owe you an apology. I let personal history cloud my judgment. I should have investigated more thoroughly before allowing this case to proceed." Kate accepted the apology with a nod, but didn't soften it with absolution he hadn't earned. "General, Victoria predicted you'd be vulnerable to manipulation. She didn't blame you for it, but she did warn me. Sometimes our past makes us weapons other people can aim. You'll have to decide whether that's acceptable." Chen stepped forward, her earlier neutrality replaced with something approaching warmth. "Sergeant Morrison, all charges are dropped effective immediately. Your record will reflect full exoneration. And if I may say so personally, your mother-in-law trained you extraordinarily well. She trained me to survive. Everything else I learned by applying her lessons to situations she couldn't have predicted." Jason still held onto Kate's arm, not quite ready to let her go, his voice small and young in a way it hadn't been for years. What happens now? Kate looked down at her son, seeing Daniel in the shape of his face, seeing Victoria in the intelligence behind his eyes, seeing the chance to teach him what strength looked like when it flowed from principle rather than position. Now we go see Sophie. Then we visit Victoria and tell her everything. Then we figure out what comes next. She didn't mention the trust fund, the millions waiting, the future that had just been secured. That conversation could wait until Jason and Sophie had processed the revelation that their uncle had been willing to sacrifice them for money, that their mother had sacrificed comfort for their protection, that family was more complicated and dangerous than fairy tales suggested. The courtroom emptied slowly, officers departing with expressions that suggested this hearing would be discussed in military legal circles for years, as cautionary tale about assumption, evidence, and the difference between documentation and truth. Kate gathered her 3 bundles, returned them to their envelope, and stood holding evidence that had just dismantled a fraud, while watching her son's face cycle through emotions too complex for his age. She wanted to promise him it would be easier from here, that the hard part was over, that family was safe now. But Victoria had taught her better than that. She'd taught Kate that safety was temporary, that vigilance was the price of protection, that the only real security came from being strong enough to face whatever came next without needing rescue from anyone else. So instead of empty promises, Kate simply took Jason's hand and led him toward the door, toward Sophie, toward Victoria lying silent in a care facility 2 hours away, toward whatever came after survival stopped being the only objective. Behind them, Thornton's voice stopped her at the threshold. Sergeant Morrison, one more question. Victoria's letter mentioned you demonstrate capability through how you handled Marcus's attack. Does that mean you're accepting the trust fund? Taking control of the $45 million? Kate turned back, her response shaped by 3 years of living as if she had nothing while knowing resources waited. That's not my decision alone, General. The money belongs to Jason and Sophie. I'm just the guardian who makes sure it serves their future instead of someone else's greed. Whether I use it or leave it untouched depends on what they need, not what I want. She paused, then added the truth that Victoria would have wanted acknowledged. But yes, I'll accept Victoria's trust. Not because I need her validation or her money, but because refusing it would dishonor everything she built. She wanted Jason and Sophie protected by someone who understood that wealth is responsibility, not entitlement. I won't let her down. The final words carried the weight of promise and threat combined. Promise to Victoria, threat to anyone else who might see her children as resources to exploit. Kate Morrison had entered this courtroom as defendant, survived it as victor, and would leave it as guardian of a fortune her children deserved and predators would never touch again. The door closed behind her with quiet finality, sealing the end of Marcus's scheme and the beginning of whatever came after. Sophie met them in the corridor outside the courtroom, her 14-year-old face anxious and pale from 2 hours of waiting without information. She looked between Kate and Jason, reading their expressions with the emotional radar that came from being the youngest in a family learning to navigate grief and reconstruction simultaneously. Is it over? Kate pulled her daughter close, felt Sophie's arms wrapped tight around her waist, with the fierce grip of someone who'd been holding fear at bay through sheer willpower. It's over. Uncle Marcus won't be bothering us anymore. Sophie pulled back just enough to search her mother's face, looking for the truth beneath reassurance. What did he do? Jason answered before Kate could find gentler words, his voice still rough from tears, but steadier now, as if confession had burned away uncertainty and left only clarity in its wake. He tried to frame Mom for stealing. He made me believe she was failing us. He was going to take us away and steal our inheritance. The words landed on Sophie like physical weight. Her face cycled through confusion, hurt, anger, finally settling on something that looked older than 14. The premature wisdom that comes from discovering adults lie not just to protect, but to exploit. He told me you'd want us to live with him. He said you were too stressed to handle raising us alone. He bought me that tablet for my birthday and said it was because you couldn't afford. Her voice broke. Kate knelt to be at eye level with her daughter, hands on Sophie's shoulders, grounding both of them. He manipulated all of us. That was his strategy. Make us doubt ourselves, doubt each other, until we were too fractured to recognize what he was doing. But we're going to be okay now. all three of us. Sophie's next question came quietly, almost reluctantly, as if she feared the answer but needed it anyway. Did you really have money the whole time? Were you pretending to struggle? The accusation underneath, that Kate had lied, had performed poverty while resources waited, required honest response rather than deflection. Victoria had taught Kate that trust couldn't be rebuilt with half-truths. Yes, Dad left us insurance money that I invested. We were never actually struggling financially. But I needed Uncle Marcus to believe we were vulnerable, so he'd expose himself trying to exploit that vulnerability. So you lied to us. The words weren't quite accusation, weren't quite acceptance, just statement seeking confirmation of reality that had shifted too quickly for a teenager to process smoothly. I withheld information to protect you both. That's not the same as lying, but I understand if it feels that way. You're old enough to be angry about that choice. You're old enough to decide whether you can forgive it. Sophie considered this, her face showing calculation that reminded Kate powerfully of Victoria. The same ability to separate emotion from evaluation, to assess situations with clarity that ignored what she wanted to be true in favor of what actually was. Did it work, your plan? Yes. Uncle Marcus is being arrested for fraud and embezzlement. The money he tried to steal from us is protected, and now you both know exactly what kind of person he is, so he can never manipulate you again. Sophie nodded slowly, processing, then surprised Kate by asking the question that cut to the heart of everything. If he'd been kinder, if he'd actually cared about us instead of the money, would you still have tested him? The question revealed Sophie's real fear. Not that Marcus had failed some arbitrary test, but that Kate might subject anyone to similar evaluation. That love in their family had become conditional and strategic rather than freely given. Kate pulled both children close, Jason on one side, Sophie on the other, speaking to them with the honesty they deserved and rarely received from adults who underestimated their capacity for complexity. Grandma Victoria set the test, not me. She wanted to know if Marcus would protect you or exploit you after she couldn't intervene. I just followed her instructions. But to answer your real question, I will always protect you both, even when that protection looks like manipulation or deception. That's what parents do. We make impossible choices so our children don't have to live with consequences we could have prevented. The three of them stood in the government building corridor, fluorescent lights humming overhead, people walking past on errands that had nothing to do with the small family reconstructing itself from betrayal and revelation. Eventually, Jason stirred, his voice hesitant. Can we see Grandma Victoria? Tell her what happened? Kate had been avoiding that conversation, unsure how to explain Victoria's condition to children who remembered their grandmother as formidable and sharp, not silent and still in institutional care. But perhaps today's revelations had prepared them for one more complicated truth. Yes, but you need to understand she may not respond. The stroke damaged her brain. She's been in a care facility for 3 years without waking up. Sophie's hand tightened in Kate's. Will she ever wake up? The doctors don't know. Brain injuries are unpredictable. We visit, we talk to her, we hope. That's all we can do. The drive to Riverside Extended Care took 90 minutes through countryside that rolled past in autumn colors, amber and rust painting the landscape in shades that suggested endings and transitions. Jason sat in front, Sophie in back, both of them quiet with their own processing. Kate drove on autopilot, her mind already at the facility, rehearsing words to speak to a woman who might or might not hear them. The facility itself was designed to look less institutional than it was. Brick exterior meant to suggest upscale retirement community, rather than warehouse for people whose bodies continued, while consciousness remained questionable. Kate signed them in at the front desk, received visitor badges, led her children down corridors that smelled of industrial cleaners and medical equipment and something indefinable that buildings acquired when they housed prolonged waiting. Victoria's room was on the 3rd floor, corner unit with windows overlooking a small garden that someone maintained with more diligence than the residents could appreciate. The room itself held expensive furniture Marcus had authorized. Leather recliner, flat-screen television, decorative plants that were probably artificial, all designed to signal care while being utterly meaningless to someone who couldn't engage with any of it. Victoria lay in the hospital bed, thin and still, her body maintained by feeding tubes and regular turning to prevent bed sores. Her face had aged dramatically since the stroke, skin papery and pale, the formidable CEO reduced to biological process without animation. Sophie gasped softly, unprepared for the reality of seeing her vital grandmother transformed into something that resembled but wasn't quite the person they remembered. Jason's jaw tightened, emotion held back through visible effort. Kate approached the bed, took Victoria's hand, cool, unresponsive, and spoke as if Victoria could hear every word. "We won. Marcus exposed himself exactly as you predicted. Jason and Sophie are safe. The trust is protected. Everything you planned worked perfectly." No response. The monitors continued their steady beeping, registering heart rate and oxygen levels and brain activity too minimal to suggest awareness. Jason moved closer, his voice thick. "Grandma, I'm sorry. I believed Uncle Marcus. I thought I should have trusted her. I should have remembered everything you taught us about family." Still nothing. Sophie took Victoria's other hand, tears sliding down her face. "We miss you, I miss you, please wake up." Kate let them grieve, let them speak to someone who might not hear, understanding that sometimes the ritual of telling truth to people who couldn't respond was about the speaker's need rather than the listener's capacity. They stayed for an hour, talking to Victoria, updating her on school and friends, and small details that felt simultaneously important and trivial. Kate told her about the courtroom, about Marcus's arrest, about Thornton's manipulated vendetta backfiring, about Chen's intervention. She spoke as if Victoria was taking notes, planning next moves, preparing advice. Finally, as visiting hours drew to a close, Kate leaned in close to Victoria's ear. "Thank you for everything, for teaching me, for protecting us, for trusting me with Jason and Sophie. I won't let you down." She straightened, began gathering their things, preparing to leave and return to normal life, whatever that meant now that the threat was neutralized, and future was suddenly open territory. Victoria's hand moved, just a twitch, a flutter of fingers that could have been involuntary muscle spasm, except that it happened exactly as Kate was turning away. Exactly timed to seem like response rather than coincidence. Kate froze, staring at Victoria's hand, waiting to see if the movement repeated. Nothing for 10 seconds, 20, enough time for her to convince herself she'd imagined it. Then Victoria's eyes opened, not fully conscious, not immediate awareness, but eyelids lifting slowly, pupils dilating, gaze unfocused and wandering before settling on Kate's face with recognition that seemed impossible after 3 years of absence. Sophie screamed, sharp sound of shock rather than fear. Jason stumbled backward, knocking into the recliner. Kate couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process Victoria's eyes tracking her face, Victoria's lips moving soundlessly, Victoria's hand squeezing with deliberate pressure. Kate hit the call button, summoning nurses, then leaned over Victoria with her heart hammering and her training completely inadequate for this moment. "Victoria, can you hear me?" The older woman's lips moved again, this time producing sound, raspy, barely audible, 3 syllables that rearranged Kate's understanding of everything. "Did you win?" The question landed like confession. Not "where am I" or "what happened," but immediate focus on the plan Victoria had set in motion before her stroke, suggesting awareness that extended beyond what Kate had believed possible. Kate's response came automatically, shaped by 3 years of assuming Victoria couldn't hear, couldn't know, couldn't participate. "Yes, Marcus is in custody. The children are safe." Victoria's eyes closed briefly, relief or exhaustion or both, then opened again with more focus, more presence, something approaching the formidable intelligence that had built an empire. "Good, took you long enough." The words, though weak, carried familiar sharpness that suggested Victoria hadn't been as absent as everyone assumed. Before Kate could ask the questions forming, medical staff flooded the room. Nurses, doctors, equipment, moving with practiced efficiency to assess the patient who just emerged from 3 years of minimal consciousness. Kate, Jason, and Sophie were ushered into the hallway, told to wait while evaluations were conducted. They stood in stunned silence, processing miracle or revelation or whatever this was, until Jason finally articulated what they were all thinking. She knew the whole time she was awake. The implications were staggering. If Victoria had been conscious, even partially, it meant she'd heard everything. Marcus's visits, his manipulation of hospital staff to limit Kate's access, his confident discussions about taking control of the company. It meant Victoria's letter hadn't been prediction, but observation, Her instructions not precaution, but strategy formed while watching her son reveal himself. 40 minutes later, Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to Admiral Patricia Chen, emerged from Victoria's room with an expression caught between professional neutrality and genuine amazement. Mrs. Morrison is awake and coherent. She's experiencing significant weakness and will need extensive physical therapy, but neurologically, she appears far more functional than her previous assessment suggested. Kate found her voice through shock. How is that possible? She's been unresponsive for 3 years. Dr. Chen's expression shifted to something uncomfortable, the look of someone about to deliver information that upended assumptions. That's what we need to discuss. Mrs. Morrison is claiming she's been partially conscious for approximately 30 months, essentially since 6 months after the stroke. She says she deliberately avoided showing signs of awareness for reasons she'll only discuss with you. The revelation transformed the last 3 years from tragedy to strategy. Victoria's apparent incapacitation becoming final test administered from position of seeming helplessness. Kate felt her knees weaken, leaned against the wall for support. She was awake, she heard everything. According to her account, yes, she wants to see you alone. Are you up for that? Kate nodded, words beyond her capacity temporarily. She turned to Jason and Sophie. Wait here, I need to talk to Grandma. Sophie's eyes were huge, face pale. Is she angry at us for believing Uncle Marcus? I don't know, baby, but we're going to find out. Victoria's room had been transformed from static vigil to active recovery. Bed elevated, monitors adjusted, nursing staff hovering with the attention accorded to patients whose sudden improvement defied medical expectations. Victoria herself sat propped against pillows, looking exhausted but undeniably present, her eyes tracking Kate's entrance with familiar sharpness. The nurse excused herself, closing the door behind her, leaving Kate alone with the woman who'd apparently been conducting psychological operations from a hospital bed for 2.5 years. Victoria spoke first, her voice weak but steady. Don't look at me like that, like I'm some monster who tortured you deliberately. Kate moved to the bedside chair, sat carefully, trying to organize thoughts that kept fragmenting against the impossibility of this conversation. You were awake. You let us think you were gone. I needed to see what Marcus would do without me able to intervene. And I needed to see if you were strong enough to protect my grandchildren without my help. The words were delivered without apology, as if strategic deception from a hospital bed was reasonable parenting rather than psychological warfare. I spent 3 years thinking you were dying. Jason and Sophie lost their grandmother on top of losing their father. You put us through that as a test? Victoria's expression didn't soften, but something flickered behind her eyes. Perhaps regret, perhaps just fatigue. Would you have fought as hard if you knew I could wake up and fix things? Would you have discovered your own strength if you believed rescue was available? The question cut through Kate's anger, forcing her to confront truth she didn't want to acknowledge. Victoria was right. If Kate had known Victoria was conscious, she might have asked for help, might have accepted intervention, might never have developed the ruthless competence that allowed her to outmaneuver Marcus without assistance. That's still manipulative. Yes, absolutely. I'm not going to pretend otherwise or apologize for strategy that kept my family safe. You wanted me to be different than I am, Kate. Softer, more emotional, less calculating. But I'm the woman who built Morrison Defense Contractors through calculated risks and strategic deception. That doesn't change just because the stakes shifted from corporate warfare to family protection. Kate absorbed this, recognizing the fundamental truth. Victoria had been teaching her since the beginning, and the final lesson had been administered from apparent incapacitation. The cruelty was real, but so was the necessity if the goal was transformation rather than rescue. When did you actually wake up? Really? Victoria considered the question, her face showing calculation even now. 6 months after the stroke. I'd regained consciousness, but had limited motor control, couldn't speak clearly. Marcus was visiting regularly, talking to me like I wasn't there, discussing his plans. I realized he was waiting for me to die, so he could take control. If I showed signs of recovery, he'd just wait longer, be more careful. But if I remained apparently unconscious, he'd move quickly and expose himself. So you stayed silent for 2.5 years. I stayed strategic. I learned to move my eyes just enough to read documents when nurses left charts in the room. I listened to every conversation. I tracked Marcus's visits, his increasingly confident discussions about taking over the company, his manipulation of Jason. I heard Jennifer coaching him on ways to undermine your custody, and I waited. The scope of Victoria's patience was staggering, lying still while family members discussed her impending death, while her grandson was turned against her daughter-in-law, while lawyers discussed her estate like she was already in the ground. Did you hear me? When I visited? Victoria's expression softened fractionally, every time. You were the only one who talked to me like I was still present. Marcus and Jennifer discussed me. You spoke to me. That mattered. Kate felt tears threatening, pushed them back through sheer will. I thought you were dying. I thought I'd lost you the same way I lost Daniel. You didn't lose me. You discovered you didn't need me. There's a difference. Daniel loved you, but he also protected you, took care of problems before they reached you, shielded you from family politics. You never had to be ruthless while he was alive. But after he died, you needed to become dangerous enough that predators wouldn't see you as prey. I couldn't teach you that through lectures, Kate. I could only create conditions where you teach yourself. The words carried weight of completed mission, strategic objective achieved regardless of collateral damage. Kate understood the logic while resenting the emotional cost, recognizing that Victoria's methods had worked precisely because they'd forced genuine transformation, rather than performative compliance. The trust fund, the $45 million, that was real? Completely real. You've earned it, Kate. You survived Marcus's assault without breaking, without compromising your principles, without becoming as ruthless as he was. That's the woman I wanted controlling my grandchildren's inheritance, someone who understands that wealth is responsibility, not entitlement. Victoria shifted in the bed, wincing with pain that suggested her body hadn't appreciated 3 years of minimal movement. But there's more we need to discuss. Decisions you'll have to make now that I'm awake, but unlikely to return to full capacity. Kate waited, understanding that this was another test, another evaluation of whether she was ready for whatever Victoria was preparing to offer. Morrison Defense Contractors needs leadership. Marcus obviously can't take over. The board has been operating without clear direction for 3 years. They're competent, but the company needs vision, someone who understands both the business model and the human cost of what we do. The implication was clear before Victoria spoke it. They want you to consider becoming CEO. Kate's immediate instinct was refusal. She was a Marine, not a businesswoman. Her identity built on service rather than corporate leadership. But Victoria's expression suggested the offer wasn't casual suggestion, but culmination of 10 years of deliberate training. I'm active duty military. I can't run a defense contractor. You could retire. You've served 15 years. You're eligible. And before you say you're not qualified, I've spent 10 years teaching you about business, about leadership, about strategy that applies whether you're coordinating operations or managing corporate contracts. You're more qualified than you think. The choice Victoria was offering wasn't just job transition, but identity transformation. From Sergeant Morrison to CEO Morrison, from person following orders to person giving them, from serving her country through military channels to serving it through defense industrial complex. I need time to think about this. Victoria nodded, exhaustion finally showing through her determination. Take the time, but understand, if you don't take the position, the board will hire someone external who'll have no loyalty to our family, no commitment to the principles Daniel and I tried to build this company around. Morrison Defense will become just another contractor optimizing profits regardless of impact. She paused, then delivered the statement that reframed everything. Daniel wanted you to have options, Kate. That's why he bought the life insurance, why he made sure you'd never be trapped by financial necessity. I'm offering you the same thing. Choice based on what you want to build, not what you're forced to accept. You can stay in the Marines if that's where you belong, but if you're ready for something else, the company is yours. Kate left the room 30 minutes later, her mind churning with possibilities that had seemed impossible hours earlier. Jason and Sophie waited in the hallway, both of them anxious for update on their grandmother, who just returned from 3 years of apparent absence. She's awake, really awake. She wants to see you both. Sophie rushed toward the door, Jason close behind, both of them desperate to reconnect with the grandmother they'd mourned. Kate let them go alone, needing space to process Victoria's offer and its implications. She found herself in the facility's small outdoor garden, sitting on a bench that probably accommodated visiting family members who needed escape from institutional environment. The autumn air carried the smell of dying leaves and earth preparing for winter. Kate pulled out her phone, stared at the screen, finally dialed a number she'd avoided calling during the 3 years of pretending to struggle. Admiral Chen answered on the second ring. "Sergeant Morrison, I assume you've heard about Victoria's recovery? How did you—" "The facility called me. I'm listed as emergency contact along with you. Victoria arranged that 3 years ago." Of course she had. Victoria arranged everything, built networks that operated independent of her conscious participation, ensured that the right people received information at the right time to support whatever plan she'd constructed. She wants me to consider retiring, taking over Morrison Defense Contractors as CEO. Chen was silent for several seconds, processing, then delivered the response Kate both expected and dreaded. "That would be significant transition. Are you considering it?" "I don't know. The Marines have been my identity for 15 years. I'm not sure who I am without the uniform." Chen's response carried the wisdom of someone who'd navigated similar transitions. "Identity is what you build, Kate, not what you wear. You'll still be the same person, disciplined, strategic, committed to service. The only difference is scope. As Marine, you protect through direct action. As CEO of a major defense contractor, you protect through ensuring the military has equipment and support they need. Both are service. Both matter." The framing helped, reposition the choice as continuation rather than abandonment of core values. "How do I decide?" Ask yourself what Daniel would want for you. Not what he'd tell you to do, but what he'd hope you'd become. Then ask if staying in the Marines gets you there, or if something else does. Kate ended the call, sat with the question, let it echo through memory and possibility, until answer emerged with clarity that felt like Daniel's voice rather than her own calculation. Daniel would want her free to choose based on what she could build rather than what she was obligated to maintain. Free to evolve beyond Widow and Marine into something larger and more complex. Free to use everything Victoria had taught her in service of a mission that extended beyond her own career. 3 weeks later, Kate submitted her retirement paperwork. The ceremony was small, her choice, attended by Jason, Sophie, Admiral Chen, and a handful of Marines she'd served with over 15 years. The folding of her flag felt both ending and beginning, closing one chapter while opening space for whatever came next. Morrison Defense Contractors Board meeting occurred 1 week after her official retirement. Kate entered the conference room wearing civilian clothes that felt foreign and formal, facing 12 people whose average age was 20 years older than her own, whose business experience dwarfed hers, whose skepticism was visible despite professional courtesy. The board chairman, Gerald Walsh, 72 years old, veteran of 3 wars and 4 decades of defense industry navigation, spoke first. "Mrs. Morrison, we appreciate your willingness to consider this position. However, we need to be direct about concerns. You have no corporate leadership experience, no degree in business management, and 15 years of military service that, while admirable, doesn't translate directly to running a $150 million company. Why should we trust you with Victoria Morrison's legacy?" Kate had prepared for this question, had spent 3 weeks considering her answer, understanding that her response would determine whether she claimed this position or remained forever in Victoria's shadow. "You shouldn't trust me because of my resume. You should trust me because for 10 years, Victoria Morrison personally trained me in every aspect of this business. She taught me to read balance sheets, to analyze contracts, to recognize when companies optimize profits by cutting corners that risk lives. She showed me the difference between companies that serve military needs and companies that exploit military budgets. And she did all of this knowing that eventually she'd need someone who understood that defense contracting isn't about maximizing shareholder value. It's about ensuring that people like me, people who put on uniforms and deploy to dangerous places, have equipment and support they can trust." She paused, met each board member's eyes individually. "I'm not the CEO you'd hire from a conventional search, but Victoria didn't want conventional. She wanted someone who'd run this company with the same principles she used to build it. Someone who'd ask, does this serve our military, before asking, does this serve our profits? If that's not what you want, I'll leave now, and you can find someone more experienced and less committed to those priorities." Walsh studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, then surprised her by smiling. Victoria told me 3 years ago you'd say something like that. She bet me $50 you'd refuse to sell yourself on credentials and would instead frame the conversation around values. I just lost that bet. The tension in the room shifted, several board members chuckling, the evaluation transforming from adversarial to collaborative. Welcome to Morrison Defense Contractors, CEO Morrison. Try not to make decisions that'll get us all thrown in federal prison. And we'll support you. 6 months into her new role, Kate visited Marcus in federal prison. She'd delayed the trip repeatedly, uncertain what purpose would be served by confronting a man who'd tried to destroy her and failed. But Victoria, recovered enough to offer advice from her rehabilitation facility, had insisted, "You need to close this loop, Kate. Not for his benefit, but for yours. You can't lead effectively if you're carrying anger you haven't processed." The visitation room was institutional gray, separated by plexiglass barriers that transformed intimacy into performance. Marcus appeared wearing prison blues, looking thinner and older than 8 months earlier, his corporate confidence eroded by incarceration and consequence. He picked up the phone on his side of the barrier, waited for Kate to do the same, his expression cycling between resentment and something that might have been shame. "I'm surprised you came." Kate's response was measured, stripped of the anger she'd expected to feel. "I came because Victoria thought I should, and because Jason asked me to." Marcus's face shifted at his nephew's name. First time Kate had seen genuine emotion from him since the courtroom. "How is he?" "Healing. He's working at Morrison Defense part-time, learning the business. Sophie's thriving at school. They're both doing better without you manipulating them." The words were harsh but delivered without cruelty. Just factual assessment of improvement following Marcus's removal from their lives. Marcus absorbed the statement, his voice rough when he finally responded. "I know you won't believe this, but I didn't want to hurt them. I wanted what I felt entitled to, and they were obstacles. That's not the same as actively wanting them damaged." "Yes, it is, Marcus. When you treat children as obstacles to overcome rather than people to protect, you're choosing to hurt them regardless of whether you frame it that way. Intent doesn't matter. Impact does." He looked away, staring at the gray wall beside them, perhaps recognizing truth he'd been avoiding throughout 8 months of incarceration. "Why did she choose you? I still don't understand. I was her son, firstborn. I should have inherited everything." Kate had had months to consider this question, to understand Victoria's thinking through the lens of everything she'd learned about power and succession and what it meant to build something versus inherit it. "She didn't choose me over you, Marcus. She chose principles over biology. She wanted Morrison Defense led by someone who'd protect the mission rather than exploit the position. You proved you couldn't do that. I proved I could. That's the only calculation that mattered to her." Marcus's response carried bitterness that probably wouldn't fade regardless of time served. "You're saying I deserve this? Prison, losing everything, becoming the family failure?" "I'm saying you earned consequences through choices you made repeatedly, despite having opportunities to choose differently. Victoria gave you options. You selected the one that prioritized your ego over your nephew's welfare. That's not bad luck, Marcus. That's bad character." She stood to leave, the conversation serving its purpose. Not reconciliation or forgiveness, but closure that allowed her to see Marcus's cautionary tale rather than ongoing threat. "Wait!" She paused, phone still pressed to her ear. Marcus's voice carried desperate urgency. "Jason and Sophie, tell them I'm sorry. Tell them I hope they become better than I was." Kate considered the request, its sincerity unclear, but its intent recognizable as attempt at redemption through proxy. "Tell them yourself. I'll bring them for a visit if you want. But understand, if you use that visit to manipulate them again, if you try to plant seeds that undermine their healing, I'll ensure you never see them again. Choice is yours." She hung up the phone, left the visitation room, drove back to her office at Morrison Defense Contractors with the weight of Marcus's failure no longer pressing on her consciousness. Victoria had been right about the necessity of confrontation, not to forgive or reconcile, but to transform Marcus from villain in ongoing drama to completed chapter in longer story. 3 years after the courtroom hearing, Kate stood in her corner office overlooking the harbor, reviewing quarterly reports that showed Morrison Defense growing sustainably while maintaining the ethical standards Victoria had insisted upon. The company had weathered her unconventional leadership, had adapted to CEO who prioritized principle over profit margins, had discovered that operating with integrity didn't preclude financial success. Jason worked 2 floors down, 20 years old, and learning the business with surprising aptitude. Sophie was at West Point, following her father's path toward military service, understanding now that family legacy included both corporate leadership and battlefield courage. Victoria had recovered enough to attend board meetings occasionally. Her physical capacity diminished, but her strategic thinking sharp as ever. She'd moved into a smaller facility focused on long-term rehabilitation, accepting help grudgingly, but accepting nonetheless. Kate's assistant knocked, entered with expressions suggesting something significant. "Mrs. Morrison, this just arrived from Victoria's attorney. He said it's urgent and personal." Kate took the envelope, recognized the law firm's letterhead, felt familiar twist of anxiety that came from knowing Victoria's urgent correspondence usually carried life-altering implications. Inside was a single letter, handwritten in Victoria's still shaky script, and a sealed envelope marked, "From Daniel," to be opened by Kate when ready. Victoria's note was brief. "Kate, Daniel wrote this before his final deployment. I was supposed to give it to you if something happened. I waited for the right time. That time is now. He saw your potential before any of us." Kate's hands trembled slightly as she opened the sealed envelope, Daniel's handwriting emerging from 3 years beyond his death. "My dearest Kate, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And I'm sorrier than words can express for leaving you, leaving our children, leaving the life we were building together. But I need you to know something crucial. Marrying you was the best decision I ever made. Not because you made me happy, though you did, but because you made me believe in possibilities I'd never considered before meeting you. My mother will test you. I've asked her to, because I know you're strong enough to pass any test she designs, and I know you'll teach Jason and Sophie what real strength looks like. Not volume or aggression, but quiet certainty that you deserve respect and will accept nothing less. Don't mourn me too long. Don't let my death become the defining fact of your life. Live fully, lead boldly, love fiercely. Show the world what Catherine Parker can do when someone believes in her capacity for greatness. I believed in you from the first moment we met. Mom believes in you now, or she will once you prove what I already know. And soon, everyone will understand that the Morrison legacy isn't about money or lineage. It's about protecting people who can't protect themselves and building institutions that serve rather than exploit. You're going to do extraordinary things, Kate. I'm heartbroken I won't be there to witness them. But I'll be watching somehow, proud of every choice you make, every battle you win, every time you refuse to accept limitations other people try to impose. All my love forever, Daniel." Kate read the letter 3 times, tears finally breaking through the careful control she'd maintained for 3 years of rebuilding. Daniel had known, had understood exactly what she'd need to survive his loss, had arranged his life insurance, and asked Victoria to prepare her, and trusted that she'd become what he'd always believed she could be. She stood at her office window, looking out at the water where vessels moved through channels that had carried operations for centuries, and spoke to the space Daniel no longer occupied. "I did it. I survived. I protected them. I became what you believed I could be." The response came not from Daniel, but from her own understanding. 3 years of growth compressed into a single moment of recognition. She'd always been capable of this. Daniel hadn't created her strength. He'd simply been the first person to see it, to name it, to insist she acknowledge what she was capable of becoming. Her phone buzzed with text from Jason. "Board meeting in 10, ready to present the new Veterans Hiring Initiative?" Kate smiled, wiped her tears, gathered her materials. She'd present the initiative, would argue for expanding veteran employment beyond the symbolic numbers most defense contractors maintained, would push the board to invest in training programs that treated veterans as assets rather than charity cases. Some of them would resist. Some would argue about costs and efficiency and market competitiveness. And she'd win anyway, because Victoria had taught her that leadership meant knowing when to compromise and when to insist. And this was insisting territory. She walked toward the conference room, Daniel's letter folded carefully in her jacket pocket, Victoria's lessons integrated into every decision, Jason and Sophie thriving despite the family betrayal that had tested but not broken them. The story that had begun in a courtroom designed to humiliate her had transformed into legacy she was actively building. Not the one Marcus had felt entitled to, not the one Victoria had handed her, but the one she'd created through surviving tests she hadn't chosen, and emerging stronger rather than bitter. At the board meeting, she presented her initiative with the same calm authority she'd brought to the courtroom years earlier. And when the board voted unanimously to approve funding, when Jason smiled at her with pride that reminded her powerfully of Daniel, when her phone buzzed with text from Victoria reading simply "well done," Kate understood the final lesson. Power isn't what you inherit or steal or demand. Power is what you build in the space between who you were and who you choose to become. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to let your worst moments define you, choosing instead to let them refine you into someone capable of protecting what matters without losing the values that make protection worthwhile. She'd entered that courtroom as Sergeant Catherine Morrison, widow, struggling mother, apparent victim. She'd left as CEO Catherine Morrison, guardian of a fortune, protector of her children, architect of a future that honored Daniel's faith and Victoria's training, while being entirely her own creation. The answer that shocked the courtroom hadn't been about money or manipulation. It had been about refusing to surrender dignity regardless of pressure applied, about understanding that strength sometimes means waiting for your adversary to destroy themselves, about knowing that victory isn't always loud, but is always complete when you've protected what matters without becoming as ruthless as those who threatened it. And 3 years later, standing in her office with her children thriving and her company growing, and her own identity finally clear, Kate understood that the story had never really been about the courtroom at all. It had been about discovering that the only person who could destroy Catherine Morrison was Catherine Morrison herself, and she'd made a different choice.